God you. Because that's what it meant to be cursed, to be damned.
What is RC Sproul talking about here? Why is he using such harsh and strong language? This is what we're going to talk about today here on Provisionist Perspective, where we promote and defend God's love and provision for everyone. So this is the beginning of a series on the Atonement. And with me, I have a special guest today, a recently published author, a podcaster, and an online friend, William Hess, Will, aka Discount Mike Winger. So he's here to discuss with us and talk about this clip. And we'll also talk a little bit about his book, his recent book that he's published, which I've been working my way through. And without further ado, here he is.
Hey guys, I'm good to be here. Yeah, Discount Mike Winger. That's been a new moniker. So apparently, if you have brown hair, glasses, and a beard, you're like Timu Mike Winger or Winger from Wish or something. So I got that going for me at least. But hey, Drew, I feel like this is something that's been long in the making and way too long to be had. I've wanted to have you on my channel for forever, and I just never set it up, and then you set me up instead. So yeah, Drew, really excited to be here on the Provisionist Perspective. Big fan of the show. Love a lot of the work there, and a lot of love a lot of the work with Eric that you did previously, and of course we know that's happened there. So really love what you guys do. Definitely behind the message of Provisionist Perspective and all that good stuff. So glad to call you a friend. Glad to be here. It's kind of cool. So
yeah, it's cool to finally have you on, and we're going to talk through this clip. I know you guys want to see more of this. Will talk more about his podcast maybe a little bit later and talk more about his book and stuff. But I want to crack right into this clip so we can talk about it, and you can see a little bit more context of this message. This is a 3-minute clip from a fuller sermon. This is taken straight out of the Ligonier page. I've not edited anything except for bleeping out the word there, just so that maybe it's a little bit more sensitive for some of our viewers here. Hopefully by the thumbnail, you've realized that you're cooking on some spice here today. So here's the full clip, and then Will and I will talk through it together.
Thomas Aquinas once was asked, Thomas, do you think that Jesus enjoyed the beatific vision through his whole life? Thomas said, I don't know. But I'm sure that our Lord was able to see things that our sin keeps us from seeing. Remember that the promise of the vision of God in the Beatitudes is the promise made to whom? To the pure of heart. Beloved, the reason why you can't see God with your eyes is not because you have a problem with your optic nerve. What prevents us from seeing God is our heart, our impurity. But Jesus had no impurity. And Thomas said he was pure in heart. So obviously he had some experience of the beauty of the Father until that moment that my sin was placed upon him. And the one who was pure no more. And God cursed him. It was as if there was a cry from heaven, excuse my language, but I can be no more accurate than to say it was as if Jesus heard the words, God you. Because that's what it meant to be cursed, to be damned, to be under the anathema of the Father. As I said, I don't understand that. But I know that it's true. And I know that every person in this room and every person outside in this hotel and on the street and across the world who has not been covered by the righteousness of Christ right this minute draws every breath under the curse of God. If you believe that, you will stop adding to the gospel and start preaching it with clarity and with boldness, because, dear friends, it is the only hope we have, and it is hope enough.
Well, Brother Will, before you kind of rip into this quote, because, as I've been studying this issue, specifically of penal substitutionary atonement, I think I've been a little bit astonished by some of the entailments, by some of the affirmations, and kind of just questioning. As many of you know, Warren and I have done 2 episodes on kind of doubts on the atonement and stuff, which were on his channel, but then mutually streamed here. And I guess there's just a lot of things that are like, I don't know that I'm really comfortable saying that. But do you want to, or is there some things that you would like to agree with first that he said before? any diamonds in the rough there?
Oh man. I guess if you truly understand the cross, I can definitely say that you could have a severe amount of thankfulness, that you wouldn't try to think that it was earning salvation in any sense. But there's very few things in there I would be hard pressed to want to agree with, and that's mainly because I don't think, and I hate to start off with such a saucy take, but there's very few takes online and in the theological space I think are as loaded with blasphemous drivel as that statement by RC Sproul. Every time I hear it, it makes my skin crawl. But it's not just because of the PSA; it's all the other things that he says that entails with PSA and his version of it. But yes.
Yeah. And I think, a part of our process as podcasters is brainstorming titles for YouTube videos and thumbnails and stuff. And at first, many of you will have seen the first thumbnail that I had, which was a photo of you and I, and did God punish Jesus or something like that. And it was titled, Discount Mike Winger Debunks Penal Substitution. And instead, I wanted to lead with this so that we could address kind of someone more famous and prominent on this issue. And I felt uncomfortable commissioning this thumbnail and kind of brainstorming it and stuff. And I was like, man, even just the thumbnail, let alone what he's saying, it does feel real uncomfortable. But nevertheless, we're here to talk about it. Why don't you just share some of your unfiltered thoughts on the clip, and then maybe we can segue that into your book and some of the things that you say there.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, in a way, as much as it makes my skin crawl, I am very thankful for RC Sproul in this sense, because no one has ever made penal substitutionary atonement so rivetingly clear as to the entailments of it than RC Sproul's statement here. His statement here, now some people will say it's an extreme version, it's a reformed extreme version of penal substitution, but it does have the entailments of it. So he said when our sin was placed upon him, it was essentially the perfect Lamb of God was clean, perfect no more, or pure no more. That which is pure no more, I think is the language he used. And which really gets scary, because it says that there was no fault found in his mouth, that Jesus was the perfect pure Lamb of God. It always was, right? There was never a point in time in scripture where it teaches that he was impure or corrupted for a period of time. In fact, quite the opposite. And to say that the Son of God, who is divine, what we would call the second member of the Trinity, he is God in the flesh, became corrupt or had sin laid on him, I take serious issue with. Because what does that even mean for God, the holy and divine, to be corrupted by sin, besides heresy, and then for God to use his term that he used there, to damn the Son or to forsake the Son, is even, and now some people are going to bring up Psalm 22. We can talk about that later. But for God to actively damn the Son or reject him or put him under anathema of the Father, the question is how can you even make sense of that theologically? Again, how can the Trinity be divided against itself if the Trinity is God? So it creates Trinitarian problems all over the place in it, let alone problems with God's justice. How is this considered justice? How could God punish Jesus in our place? For those who are unfamiliar with the term of penal substitutionary atonement is the idea that God punished Jesus in our place, or that Jesus took on the penalty, hence penal, in our place. So it's not on your behalf. It's not representative as much as it is substitutionary. Something happened to him that did not happen to you because he took your place. So it is classically taught in most, in a lot of like evangelical seminaries. Most Protestant seminaries teach this as well. Oddly enough, the Catholic Church doesn't teach this, nor does the Eastern Orthodox. Now, some people will do the genetic fallacy there and be like, well, if they don't teach it, then we should. Doesn't this show that we're more biblical? Not necessarily. When you talk about how uncomfortable the clip made you, and even titling this thumbnail, a lot of times people will be like, yeah, that's the gospel, it's uncomfortable. And they almost equate the idea of something being uncomfortable as being truthful. And just because something is uncomfortable does not verify that it's somehow okay. It's so just because I want to make people make sure that they're clear that just because it makes you uncomfortable doesn't suddenly be like, oh, well, that means I have to humble myself and my humanity. No, it can also be a thing that's saying, hello, this is wrong. I find it interesting that the same people who will dismiss you by saying it makes you uncomfortable, they'll dismiss you by saying, oh, that's your human understanding, are the same people who appeal to, a moral argument or a transcendental nature to the universe to tell people what is right and what is wrong, and they know deep down what is right and what is wrong, and that's how they can know that it's always wrong to torture a kitten because that's objectively wrong. Well, that makes you uncomfortable, right? Okay, well then use that same measuring stick that you're using over here, and maybe we can actually start finding some common ground on how to actually discuss this complex topic of the atonement.
I was trying to make, by the way, I'm so sorry. I was trying to make one of our biggest fans and viewers, Peter Fox, a mod.
I love that guy.
And I banned him and removed all of his comments by accident. So I don't know how to undo that. And I've just done that live. Please come back on another account, Peter. How do I do this?
Oh no.
Hang on.
Oh, that's so unfortunate.
What did I do? Here we go. Add as moderator. Will that bring him back?
I don't know.
Standard moderator, save.
I've never
He's now a standard moderator.
Is Peter back?
Somebody tell me if Peter's back. Oh man. Okay. I was listening to everything that you said, Will, I promise.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
We're going to edit this out in post.
Fox. Peter Fox is great. He's one of our supporters too, like over at the Church Split. I love that guy.
Yeah. He was the main reason why I did the recent interview with Brant Hansen on being unoffendable, which I really enjoyed doing that interview, enjoyed reading that book. But back to the issue at hand. Yeah, I really appreciate what you said, and just something that I've been thinking on, and I'm still kind of undecided on this. I know that I have a lot of questions about PSA, and I'm reading your book, as many of you know, and I just have a natural skepticism, and so I'm reading and I'm trying to test things and stuff, trying not to add another heresy to my belt. But you've brought up what I think is a valid point regarding our intuitions or our morals and things that make us uncomfortable. Just because something makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean that it's spiritual and true. It could be the Holy Spirit or your conscience telling you, maybe this isn't quite right. I mean, I know you've been engaging with actual Mike Winger recently in your response videos. And one of the things that he even said that I thought was interesting was that he felt uncomfortable talking about God pouring out his wrath on Jesus. And as I heard that, I thought, I kind of thought that was pretty standard PSA stuff. I probably would have said something like that. And it's really interesting that Mike feels uncomfortable saying that. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if you've gotten to that yet in your responses. I've listened to a few of yours, but I know Warren and Paul Bondrady have responded to that. But I think that's a really valid point for consideration.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's where there's different versions of PSA. But oddly enough, when I was studying the atonement, I definitely reached really quick. Okay, God did not pour out his wrath on Jesus. There's nowhere, even in an Isaiah 53 reading from the PSA perspective, is wrath ever poured out. So I reached that conclusion of like, okay, that's just not a thing. And I said that while talking to our mutual friend David Paulman on an interview with David Paulman, and James White actually clipped that and called me a heretic for denying that God poured his wrath out on the Son. So it is actually, it's funny because to a lot of people, even Mike Winger, who's trying to defend PSA, to a lot of people, just denying that aspect alone, it puts you under heresy. And just so we're clear, I just want to make sure we're very clear on this. An atonement model was never entrenched in the church in any of the earliest creeds or anything like that. It was never ever mentioned as requiring a particular atonement model to reach to be heretical, to reach heresy or anything. So when people say like levy like these atonement theories and people just start calling each other heretics over, I always kind of find it amusing because the church had never found it a way or necessary to make it one way or the other, which is ironic, of course, because that's what they do. But and atonement theories did exist in the early church, but they just never said this is the theory the church is going with. That never happened.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's been interesting to me as I've been researching this, and I'm not really like a creeds guy, you know. I'm one of those pointy-headed fundamentalist, guys that don't mind being called biblicists or whatever. But I do think it's interesting that, as far as I can tell, the ecumenical church councils have never felt the need to anathematize or address or whatever. It's just kind of become a given that if you reject this, you're heresy, you're heretical or whatever. And I guess as I've been exploring this, for those of you that might be questioning, or for those of you that are maybe you're just like real vehement on the PSA side, I don't know. But for me, it's simple enough for me to hold on to the good news of Jesus, that he loves me, he's given his life for me, and because of that, I can be forgiven and have been forgiven of my sins because I've trusted in him. How that cashes out, to me, I feel like I can welcome any Christian who's trusting in Christ alone for his forgiveness with whatever atonement model you have. Now, maybe a lot of you are going to disagree with that. I know some people like Mike Winger and like Brother David Allen, who we're going to have on here in a couple weeks, have said that PSA is essential. I don't know necessarily what that means, if that means like a rejection of it means that you're rejecting the gospel or whatever. But Peter's back. Great.
He's alive.
And you're a mod.
He got banned from the channel for like 5 minutes.
He was killed and then resurrected with a promotion. But yeah, I mean, and maybe we can talk a little bit about your book, because one of the things that I have appreciated so far has been the deep dive. And I'll say this about your book, and for those of our viewers that are listening, watching, whatever, one thing that I really like about your book is that you say in the confessions, in the introduction, listen, I'm just a dude who's wrestling with this. I thought about writing it in a particular way. I'm writing it in my own voice, so it's a little bit more informal. And so it does kind of feel like you're sitting next to a friend and he's just kind of talking with you about these issues. And you obviously get into some of the nitty gritty and stuff like that. So it is technical in that sense. It's robust in that sense. But the voice that you carry, and I think it's been interesting seeing your content and knowing you a little bit, and then reading the book. I'm like, man, he's quite different in this book and very kind of understated and stuff in a way that I don't think I've seen him before. And I appreciate that about the tone of the book, that it is very, sometimes you say things and you say something like, I think that not necessarily, it doesn't have to be read this way. And I think, dang, I probably just would have been like, this is rubbish. but you say it in a way that I think is accessible. And for people like me that are questioning and things, you present your objections quite strongly, but it's also in such a way that is, I don't know, humble and
Well, I
like you're
appreciate
chatting with a
that.
friend.
That was intentional. So, so here's what's funny, and you know this doing the YouTube thing when you podcast. So when you podcast, it's you, your mic, and your camera, which means you kind of get your complete personality raw and unfiltered out. So if I'm like responding to something I theologically disagree with, one, the show has to be entertaining. Nobody wants to listen to somebody like, well, you know, like, no, I'm going to give you my full unfiltered opinion because you're tuning into a show that I am the host of. So I'm assuming you're there to hear my unfiltered opinion. And so that's what the show is for. The show is for that. However, I look at the book as something slightly differently. I was looking at it as I was writing this book on the atonement and against penal substitution and offering what I call a classical view of the atonement. I was trying to think of like what would be the most effective way to reach someone like myself who was questioning. And the reason for the book in the first place was because I never considered myself the guy who's going to write a book. I always thought it'd be cool, but then I was also like, everything's been covered 1,000 times. There's nothing I could add to the conversation. So, but what I realized in my atonement study is that there is no singular volume that I could put in someone's hand that says, no, and just go, look, I know you think penal substitution is the gospel. I know you think it's a super important thing. Who knows what Dr. David Allen thinks about that whole thing. But I know you think that, but there is another view, and I could just recommend, hey, why don't you buy this book and read this book and you'll be fine. I couldn't do that. It didn't exist. In fact, every chapter in my book deals with a very deep topic that you could deep dive for a long time into. So what I did is I decided, well, I'll make that book exist. So I made the book exist, but then I also one of my biggest frustrations I was dealing with was the penal substitutionary atonement is, oddly enough, probably the most criticized view in all of scholarship of atonement. Scholarship is very brutal to penal substitution, yet it is the most prominent view in evangelical and Protestant churches, which is odd that it's the most criticized over here, but yet the most promoted over here, which just goes to show that within the academy and the church, there really is a divide. And so my goal was to try to find a way, how can I marry this and bring these studies over here to these people? And it is technical. There's a lot of technical nuances and distinctions that need to be made. So I did it in a way that exactly how you actually framed it, which is I was like, how would I sit down and explain this to a friend? And that's what I did. Is so you're reading it as if I'm explaining to a friend, because believe it or not, guys, I'm actually a pastor in my day job. So I actually am not always this guy on the church split who's derisive and says this like no nonsense. So there is a pastoral side to me. That's actually where my heart lies. So yes, I'm glad you noticed that, because I'm not sure how many people connected the differences between the tone of the channel versus the tone of the book. And it's because if you want me to debate and argue, I can debate and argue. But if you want me to make a case, I'll make a case as if you're my friend. So that's kind of the tone there. I don't know if there's more you were going to ask there, but anyway.
No, yeah, I just appreciated the tone of the book in that aspect. And I think it's, and I do get the sense that it's I'm about halfway through now. I've got off my reading plan a little bit, so I'm gonna finish reading it. Don't worry, but it is quite accessible. And one thing that I enjoyed that maybe you could talk about a little bit, and then I would really like us to talk about some of the penal substitutionary atonement proof texts and kind of address those. We talked about that a little bit backstage. For instance, and I'll try to see if I can explain. I was trying to explain this to my wife earlier today. You were saying that oh gosh, I can't remember at the moment. Like, for instance, sin offering should actually be understood as is it cleansing or purification offering or something like that?
Yes.
And then there was another one that was when it says a guilt offering, the word there isn't like a legal penalty of guilt, but is more about another type of uncleanliness or something. I'm probably paraphrasing wrongly, but
yep. No, you're on the right track. So, and for those who don't know, you can find all this information. I have the book right here, Crushing the Great Serpent. Did God Punish Jesus? You can order it on Amazon. It's available on Kindle, hardback, paperback. It's a popular level book, and I have been told by many people it's super easy to read. That was the goal, to again bridge the gap between the academy. And the academy and the church. Some people, I got a couple emails by some people who were really well read, like, well, this, a little bit more technical here. And I'm like, I know, I'm trying not to get lost in the weeds here with people. That's the idea. So yeah, the Levitical offerings, one of the biggest things that almost always comes up when you're talking about penal substitution is this idea of, well, what about the offerings? All those offerings, those sacrifices, they were killed and the people didn't die and the animal did die. There you go, i.e. penal substitution. The blood was spread and that's all you need to know. And, to be fair, from a Western perspective, and if you've been taught that your entire life, I get it. But if we read Leviticus carefully, you'll notice it never talks about any of those offerings dealing with the wrath of God. In fact, it talks a lot about the cleansing, and the killing of the animal is barely even the focus. Usually what the focus is what to do with the animal after it's been offered, after it's been sacrificed. So, all right, you take the blood here, you pour it there, you sprinkle that, and you put these organs there, you cook these for people, you give this part over to God. That's really where the focus lies, which is really bizarre, because if it was the idea of punishing something, you'd think the emphasis would be on the killing, and it's just like, yeah, sacrifice the animal. Anyway, now that we got that out of the way, here's all these other the things that you actually need to do, which means that there's symbolism probably more going on. And I'm not the first scholar to talk about a scholar. I'm not actually technically a scholar, I'm a pastor, but I'm not the first person to talk about this. The scholars have been talking about this for a while. Jacob Milgram has an amazing commentary on Leviticus, but it's a little heavy for those who are not looking for that. A more readable version of it would be Lamb of the Free, and an even more readable version of it is just Crushing the Great Serpent. Okay, so you go from top tier to mid scholarship to pop level. They're your tiers. But essentially, a sin offering, the term hatat, which is your sin, the same word for sin and sin offering in Hebrew is the same exact word. And the idea of the sin offering was actually to purify not the person, but the holy space. Because God talks about continually wanting to dwell with his people. And so what I get criticized a lot when I go on channels and talk about this is people say all the time, like, well, you didn't address the Bible. Well, I'm addressing the Bible by giving you cultural context that allows you to reread that and go, oh, that's what's happening. So I don't need to read you 16 proof texts. I need to just reframe this in the proper historical context. So what the blood was the blood was a symbol of life. And the idea was giving life back to the creator. So it's a gift to him. And then also the blood was life. And they literally felt like your sin kind of air-solated off of you. It just like what's his name from Peanuts? Like the kid who walked around who's dirty and it fluffed around off of him.
He has flies buzzing around him. I don't know his name, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So it's like that. And they believe that dust or that aerosolization of the sin actually contaminated the holy space, which is God's home. So you're essentially getting your dirtiness all over the place. And they had to purify that. And now they believed that, essentially sin equaled death. Sin was death. And if the blood is life, because it says the life of the creature is in the blood, that they basically were taking the pure life, which is why the creature was pure and perfect. It was a beautiful gift to God. It was giving your best to God. And you're taking that blood and then you're cleansing it. You're cleansing out the corruption and the dirtiness, and you're cleaning his home with that. And then you're giving life back to him because you brought death. And so it's a gift. It was never this idea that we're punishing the creature. That wasn't part of it. It was actually a purification ritual. N.T. Wright's talked about this. Dr. Michael Heiser's talked about this. Andrew, what's his name from Lamb of the Free's talked about this. I could keep going, but it's a pretty common thing that most people actually are pretty familiar with.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that I appreciate about your book, and somebody has said this in the comments, Spartan Knight, the Atonement should be explainable without having to teach Jewish culture. I don't know if this is actually true, because in order to have a good understanding of the context, you need to understand what certain terminologies meant. And for instance, we come from an innocence versus guilt culture, which is very friendly to the PSA model. It's why it resonates with us culturally in the West. But the culture of their time and in the Middle East and so on is honor shame. And they're very concerned with cleanliness and uncleanliness. And when it comes to having committed a sin, they're going to not feel guilty, but feel ashamed and unclean. So I don't think that you really can adequately explain the atonement unless you start getting into some of these things. And that's one thing, again, I appreciate about your book was you talking about this uncleanliness versus cleanliness and how it was viewed culturally. and it does help frame things
Well,
differently.
and
And
to say
you
that,
just meant,
sorry, and to say that you don't need to understand Jewish culture to explain the atonement would be like you not having to explain what was going on in the 1700s when the Declaration of Independence was written. Like, no, you should know the historical context of what's being said, or otherwise you could grossly misread the situation. Which is what I'm offering. I'm saying we have gotten it wrong. We have the Protestant and evangelical church has gotten it wrong. And we just need to just go back and correct it. It's fine.
yeah. And one thing that you've just said now that I think is an important nuance, and hopefully I get this correctly. Again, I was trying to explain this to my wife and kind of ask her what she thought about this difference. Under PSA, when you're thinking about the Old Testament sacrificial system, and for instance, you think about a passage like the one in Hebrews 9 where it says all things are cleansed by almost all things are cleansed by blood, I think it says.
Yep.
And without the shedding of blood, there is no remission or there is no forgiveness. And so usually the way I would see that is, and for instance, there's the passage in Leviticus that you just quoted regarding the life is in the blood. And usually I would think, okay, the animal dies and it's the death that produces the blood. And so the blood is associated with the death, which is the penalty or wage of sin or whatever. And that's why the animal has to die. But you made a good point that the life is in the blood. And when you take the blood, you're actually taking life and sprinkling it and cleansing it over the defiled place. And I kind of thought to myself as I was reading and read that passage, that's an interesting dynamic twist as far as.
Yeah, and it was very common back then that's what these cultic rituals really were about. Like a lot of the Israelites had a unique take on them, but it wasn't uncommon for the other cultures around them to do similar things and to view those things similarly. Actually, the idea of a penal substitute wasn't even really a thing back then. So even more fascinating is the idea of the mercy seat, and the term for atonement in the Hebrew is kippur, or kafar, depending on how you want, whatever version you have. But kippur is typically what it is in the peel verb. And what this means essentially is, and people have argued what this means because it's a very strange word, but scholars seem to agree that it actually stems from the Akkadian word meaning to wash or to cleanse. So again, even the word itself for atonement isn't dealing with this idea of bringing at one mint through a penal substitute, but bringing at one mint through cleansing. Because the idea was God is holy, and our corruption. Why that it also makes sense why God talks about leaving His house so often, threatening to leave the presence of Israel. They need to repent, or He will depart from them. Because He's not going to live in a dirty home. He's not going to live amongst dirty people. They need to be pure. They need to be clean because they're supposed to represent Him. It's supposed to be the new Eden, right? So it's like if you get with the kind of the symbolism here, you understand that God's like, no, I need you to do this. But then it also explains why He says, I don't care about your offerings because your heart's not in it. You're not doing it the right way. You don't care about this. You're just doing rituals. The point of the rituals was always to be in a participatory relationship with God, to give you something physical to do with the spiritual. So, yeah, and even even the guilt offering, a good idea to understand this is that it was a reconciliation offering, and it was not for intentional sins. It was only for unintentional sins. And also these types of offerings, so when people are like, yeah, but the guilt, what do you do about the guilt? Here's what's fascinating. Some of these offerings were given for things that weren't even sinful. Touching a dead body, that's not sinful. Menstrual cycles, there was seminal discharges. Those things were all things but you'll notice they're all associated with death or life. And so it's the idea of cleansing again from the corrupted state of this world before you enter God's holy space, because you want to keep His home clean. And it was even more fascinating that they have different levels of your purification. And if you did what they call sinned with a high hand, or in other words, with rebellion, and you intentionally sinned, there was no offering that could actually offer forgiveness. The only way to deal with that was actually repentance. And then they believed that instead of, because we have in our legal sense, we seem to believe justice has to be done and wrath has to go somewhere. So if you're guilty, that wrath and justice is going to be poured out on you. But to them, they also believe that once someone repented, it took their heart and their personhood as going from a place of guilt into a place of neutrality again. So now that it's neutral, God does it, the wrath is no longer necessary because you have now restored yourself to repentance. So there is, which goes back into the repentant belief, or the kingdom of God is at hand, and a lot of that imagery we see. So just understanding that, and a lot of these offerings, and another good sign that this is not about penal substitution is that there's even like poor versions of these offerings. So if you could not afford to give a lamb because you weren't rich enough, they would even accept like flour because you're poor. So it's about this idea, again, of giving something wonderful to God to reconcile that relationship. And the way I explain it is every husband has had a wife who's probably upset with him at one point, that wasn't too happy with some of the decisions he's made. And maybe this husband was like, okay, my wife's mad at me. He's at work and he's like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to leave work. I'm going to get her some flowers. I'm going to get her some chocolate. I'm going to buy her some jewelry. And I'm going to come home because I want to show a gesture of my love of restoration and restitution in our relationship. And people go, yeah, we've all done something like that. Well, that's the exact idea of what these offerings were supposed to be. Was this idea of thank you, God, for everything you did. So sorry about the offense. Sorry about the mess. Here you go. Honoring your patron. But going back to the honor shame culture. So anyway, I hope that helps. Maybe that can help clarify, because even the grain offerings, wave offerings, they were just waved and then they were consumed. The peace offering was actually consumed by the community, not by God. But the idea was that they shared a meal with God. So they took part of it, they burn it over here to God, and then the rest of the people would eat together as a community. And because God's not physical, he can't actually eat, but the aroma is sweet to the smell. Is it pleasing to him? And what's oddly enough is that people will be like, see, that's penal substitution. It was pleasing to him. I'm like, how is pleasing a good smell at a barbecue something that's supposed to be pleasing God's wrath? That doesn't make sense. It's like another thing, a concept we insert into the text. It says it displeased him. Why? Well, because if you're having a good cookout with all your friends, because of the peace God has brought in your life, you're going to be sharing that and communing in that, and that community and fellowship is good. That's why the peace offering was also spontaneous. It was not about making peace with your creator. It was about celebrating the peace or provision he brought in your life. And you celebrated it with God and your community through a meal, which, because sharing meal is a big community thing. It's also why Paul talks about not sharing a meal with those who are unclean. We could go on and on and on, but it's a major part of Jewish culture, and understanding that can really help us understand how this all relates to their relationship with God.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what you think about this, and you don't talk as yet about this in the book, but one thing that I think about sometimes with regards to communion, when we have the bread and the wine or the grape juice, is that it's often a very somber, let's think about our sin and how much Christ had to pay. And I think that is a valid aspect that we should meditate on when we're thinking of the cross.
Yes.
But if you take into account the Old Testament precedent of this, and even the disciples' first taking of this supper, the Last Supper, and how he introduces that and stuff, do we picture them as being very somber, or are they having a meal together and enjoying one another's presence, and it being viewed as this fellowship and just communion of joy and things? And I think that when you lose some of that, as one of the commenters has said, Jewish history, customs, Eastern customs, and Eastern mindset, that you're going to miss some of that. And I was just, as I was thinking about some of these things and reading your book, I thought it'd be really nice if communion was a little bit more joyful sometimes.
Yes.
and not just, oh Lord, please, forgive me or whatever.
Yeah, well,
But
because it goes back into it's a Passover. That's the other interesting thing, is that people want to compare Jesus to the sin offering and all this other stuff. And it's like, yeah, you can find shadows there, and there's some connections that Hebrews makes to some of those things. But the one that Christ and John the Baptist were really just like pounding in was the Passover. And that was a celebratory thing of freedom, of the Exodus from oppression and tyranny.
yeah, that's true.
And so it's like it was awesome. It wasn't somber. It was just like, yeah, God destroyed his enemies and he freed us. And then on top of that, like even the Passover, again, blood being life, they also looked at blood as being covenant because it's pledging your life to somebody. So is it any shocker whatsoever that the blood, the life of people was pledged on doorposts? Like we are pledging ourselves to Yahweh. Because in the midst of all the pagan gods, also fun fact, the lambs were sacred creatures and goats were sacred creatures to the Egyptians. So they actually like desecrated their sacred icons when they killed them. It was like it's a very metal thing in there where they're straight up like making a polemic and a challenge to the Egyptians. But at the end of the Exodus, we see that actually a group of Egyptians left with them. Said it was a mixed multitude. So that means Egyptians denounced the pagan gods at some point in this whole Exodus.
Because they were scared. They were like, this Yahweh don't play no games.
Yeah,
I'm getting up out of here.
I don't want it.
Yeah. I don't want none of this smoke. I'm done.
Yeah, exactly.
Take me with the Jewish people.
Yeah, literally.
What do I have to do again? Oh, I don't know about that part.
Yeah, and
that part
that's
sounds
also
painful.
the fascinating part is that means the Egyptians had to physically denounce, like by grabbing it, slicing it, like they had to physically denounce the icons of the pagans and then pledge that to Yahweh. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's a really neat little nugget in there.
And I wish I could remember this point that I had because, man, hopefully the Lord will bring it back to me in this broadcast. But it was about the denouncing and kind of the switching over and stuff. But anyways, I wanted to bring in this comment here. Mindwarn says, I love Will. I keep thinking he makes great points, but then I remember the trampoline incident. And I just remember, you busted your leg and therefore everything that you have to say is worthless because that was a foolish move.
Yeah, apparently. For
those of you that don't know, Will had a little bit of an accident. It's been,
almost a year.
How long ago was it?
Almost a year. I did a backflip, destroyed my tibia and fibula, needed surgery. But then Calvinists were saying online, Chris Harris specifically, that it was a very foolish decision I made because I didn't have insurance at the time. I didn't belong on a trampoline. So therefore, because of that, you can't take a single word I say seriously. I'm like, I make one bad call and suddenly my theology is trash.
I was thinking, by the way, Will, how is your leg? Like, is it pain free? Are you?
Oh, it's not pain free now.
Okay.
I'm at about 90% with it. I still can't move it fully up, and it's still painful. I work out, and leg day is always the hard day. And it's like the muscles can, but the other parts can't as well. So it's still working on it. It's a recovery process. All
right. Well, pray for Will's leg that it'll get to 100%. I know what body pain is like, and that's not fun. Before we continue into some of our content here and talking about Will's book, I'll answer this question in the chat and kind of segue into a little bit of what we have coming up here on Provisionist Perspective. Grace Mercy Rass says, can someone suggest a good debate on PSA for and against? So I am currently in conversation with Will and David Paulman to have a PSA debate. Paulman would be for, David Paulman would be for, and Will would obviously be against here on this channel. So we've thought maybe me being a little bit more of a neutral party could facilitate this. They're friends, so it would be a good discussion. It's not going to be like my most recent debate. It's going to be fun and good. And I think it would be a really good way to sort of cap off. I mean, I'm sure we will continue to talk about the Atonement here on this program, but cap off our Atonement series, which we're launching today here with Will. On that note, next week, I will be interviewing James Agnew, who has a book called The Devil's Disbarment. So I'll be talking to him. It's this upcoming Sunday. I'm sorry, I don't have the dates. I'll put them in the description. As soon as all of that is up, I'll put the links below so that if you're watching this a few weeks from now, you could just kind of follow the whole thing. After that,
interested in that,
yeah. After that, I'm having Brother David Allen on, who I'm reading his book Atonement. He is a traditionalist, provisionist guy who is very pro PSA. So please bring all of your questions for a PSA advocate to him. I know there was a list of questions that you had in your book regarding the consistency of PSA and wrath and wasn't removed and so on. Some of those I could ask him, but please bring those questions. And then I have somebody else in mind who hopefully I will be able to bring on just a little bit before Easter. And then probably the debate will be after Easter to give the brothers plenty of time to prep and all of that stuff. So stay tuned for that. Pray that the future possibility will become an actuality and we can make it happen here on this channel. And yeah, without further ado, so we've been talking about Old Testament sacrifices. We've talked about the Passover and Jesus being the Lamb of God. Maybe you can talk about, because I found this interesting. Viewers, I don't know if this is interesting to you. If you want to get into the PSA proof text already, I'm sorry. We're still talking about Old Testament. Stick around. Will's going to address some of the PSA proof texts. The scapegoat, the Day of Atonement. This is often used to talk about one goat being killed and the sins being transferred to the goat. You address this idea in your book, this idea of sins being imputed or transferred, one being sent out. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and some of what you have in your book on that issue?
Yeah, so the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, or Leviticus 16, for those who are wondering. The whole scapegoat thing. So a lot of people will point to it and be like, well, the hands are placed on the goat, the sins of the people were confessed onto it. This was done every year. And then that goat was sent out into the wilderness, bearing the sins of its people. The problem here is a few. One, if it's about penal substitution, the wrong goat dies because the original goat, the one goat is brought up to the temple and sacrificed and used to cleanse the holy space on behalf of the people. And then the one that has all the sins confessed over it, it says is sent to Azazel or Azazel, depending on how you want to say it, which is a demonic figure in the Mediterranean Near Eastern context. Okay, so they sent it out to the devil essentially, and so it gets to live. So if all the sins are transferred to it and the sin is bearing on that goat, just like, and it's supposed to be creating this image of Jesus, right, where all our sin is placed on Jesus and he's bearing our sin, and then he's killed in our place, this goat's the one that gets to live and it gets sent away. But the other goat, the pure goat, the goat without the sins confessed over it, gets to be killed. That doesn't make a lot of sense as far as the typology is concerned. So really what's happening here, and it seems like scholars pretty well agree on this as well, is the fact that the sins are confessed over the creature to symbolize them taking the sins on the creature and getting them out of Dodge, getting it away from people. It no longer belongs in Israel because sin does not belong in Eden. It belongs out in the wilderness. And the wilderness, for those who don't know, and you can probably tell if you read your Old Testament carefully, the wilderness was associated with evil and demons and evil places. Because Israel is considered the good place and everywhere else is pretty much considered bad, because that's where all the Canaanites and Amalekites and all the bad people were. So the idea was they're cast the sin out from among them, and then from all the sin that people pile up, the filth that people pile up over the year, a sacrifice is made on behalf of the people to cleanse it once a year. So that's what was really happening there, because again, it doesn't make sense that if the one that has all the sin transferred to it is killed, it gets to live, then it's not killed, then it's not a penal substitute. The other thing is that if you get into the reading, like William Lane Craig's book and others, they make a really big deal about the double hand pressing on that goat, because every other offering has one hand press, and this one has both hands pressed on it. And what a lot of people say that the two hand pressing is symbolizing the transfer of sin, or it is transferring sin. Some people think it's actually literally ontologically being transferred. Other people say it's symbolic. I think it's all symbolic. I don't think sin is actually transferable. I don't think it's something I can pick up and give to somebody else. But they're like, that's it, the transfer. And that's odd because it seems like it's more a designation, just like you would in any ritual. You designate by putting your hands on stuff. And that's very normal, because even when there was successors chosen by Israelites, it says all throughout the Bible, like I think in Kings especially, when it talks about successors of different rulers, they would place their hands on them. So it's this idea of identification and ownership. And so culturally, all that always seems to be just a designation ceremony. It doesn't actually seem to connect to the idea of a penal substitute in any way, or a transference of sin. What seems to connect the transference of sin is actually people confessing their sins over it, and that seems to be more associated with that. And again, it's symbolic of casting, because otherwise, to be able to just, if I could just transfer all my sins to a goat, literally, I'd be sitting in pretty good shape, honestly. So. But that's not how that works. And most PSA advocates are sharp enough to realize how absurd it would be to think that your sin is actually transferred to a goat. But once in a while, you do run into some people who do believe that.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, because one thing that I've been thinking about approaching this issue is that if we're talking about the atonement, and we're talking about Jesus, and we're talking about the types and so on, then one would expect, if you go into the Old Testament, and this is why we're talking about all of this, maybe I'm just saying this for no reason, and this is obvious to everyone, and I'm just talking because I'm talking, I don't know, but when you're looking at the Old Testament, you're looking for, is there penal substitution in the Old Testament that's clearly there? And I gotta be honest, while I really resonate with the idea of penal substitution to a certain extent, I'm beginning to struggle to see it in these Old Testament things. And that's part of the goal of going through each of these books and reading Dr. David Allen's book on this issue is okay, well, what does he have to say about it? And let's bring our questions to him and let's see what he says. Hopefully this can kind of create some conversation, and you guys, viewers, can go on this journey.
Especially with PSA advocates, because what I have found in most of my readings of PSA advocates is that PSA is just kind of assumed in the Old Testament. I haven't found a lot of them that really unpack the Old Testament context and still teach PSA. Actually, Agnew is if you're having him on, I'm really excited. I actually wanted to reach out to him and interview him, because he actually challenges it in a unique way. I have a chapter dedicated to Satan and the demonic powers, but it's very broad, and I use the divine council worldview a little bit, but just kind of creating the backdrop of what spiritual warfare is going on and why the atonement matters in that way. And he wrote an entire book on that, which is really cool, because it came out after my book came out, but now I get to point people to that as hey, if you want more about how the spiritual world connects to it, because he pretty much reiterated everything I was trying to reiterate in such a short space. So it was pretty cool to find somebody else who I was hey, he's doing the thing that I was connecting, and I didn't see anyone else do that yet in most of my readings. So it was just really cool. I'm excited to listen to your conversation with him.
Yeah, me too. I'm looking forward to it. And I think that he's planning to make his book free on Kindle for a certain stint of time around that time that we broadcast. So you might check. I already own it, so I don't know if it's going to show up as free on my end, but you can check The Devil's Disbarment by James Agnew, see if that's free yet. If it's not yet, it probably will be, or should be, by the time we interview this upcoming Sunday, which is on the, I don't know what it is. Do the math. I'm sorry. I should know these things. I should know the dates of my own.
Man, it's on the day,
Here's a comment from a PSA advocate person here, Dave Van der Velde. No PSA, no gospel. What do you think about that, Will? Any thoughts on that?
This here is when I always like to tell people to slow their roll. Because if you say there's no PSA, no gospel, that is a big claim. For one, it means that if your atonement theory doesn't hold up, then there is no gospel. And these are theories. And fun fact for you, PSA, penal substitution, did not exist in the early church. In the first 1,000 years, no one talked about a satisfaction theory, that God had to have something satisfied within him. Anselm started teaching it around 1000 AD, but it was about his justice being satisfied, because they looked at it as a feudal lord, that our sin dishonored him. And then later on, it was in the Reformation, during around the time of the 1600s and all that you start seeing this idea of wrath needing appeasement and the penal substitution. Now, a lot of people want to quibble, and they'll start quote mining, and they confuse dying for, in the early church, oh, he died for us, and that means, penal substitution. But again, you can do a lot of things for somebody without being a substitute or a penal substitute. A good example is soldiers. Soldiers die for their countries, but they're not taking a punishment other people's punishment. They're dying basically as martyrs for their homeland. So it's not just, and then some people read the early church and see the word penalty, but Oliver Crisp and quite a few other scholars have also pointed out that the term penalty didn't necessarily mean punishment back then. We're reading that into it. Penalty a lot of times also meant like just simply like a disadvantage or a loss. So because, you know, I could take, I can right now, a good example, my leg. I can't run right now as a penalty of breaking my leg. I can barely run. Like I kind of hobble when I run. It's a really awkward looking, I look like a dumb duck, like kind of, anyway. So that's a penalty of breaking my leg. Now, does that mean it's a punishment for breaking my leg? No, it's a disadvantage or a loss. So it's important that we understand these distinctions and not to play word games where we equivocate one word with one definition when the early church used other definitions. But the gospel, I really highly recommend reading Matthew Bates' work, Salvation by Allegiance Alone. He talks about read every single, actually do me a favor, Yi, who said this, read every single proclamation of the gospel in the book of Acts. And you'll find no PSA. There's no this idea of Jesus Christ took your punishment, satisfied the wrath of God, and none of that. What's emphasized is that he died for us to save us, and that he ascended and is at the right hand of the Father. That is mostly his kingship and like lordship that's emphasized, and his victory over sin, death, and Satan at the resurrection. That's what's emphasized by Paul, and that is what's emphasized by the apostles in the book of Acts. You will not find PSA in any of the gospel presentations in Acts. So you'd be hard pressed. Does that mean those other people did not have the gospel and they were preaching? So we have to be careful not to just take, again, the modern lens and shove it in where it doesn't exist. And we have to be very conscientious of those sorts of things. Otherwise, we risk being similar to our Reformed brothers and sisters who just read Romans 9 and only see, you know, particular election and all that jazz. So anyway.
Yeah, thanks for answering that question. If you have any questions for Will, by the way, please put them in the chat. It's helpful if you tag Provisionist Perspective or if you type question in all caps. You can also ask some questions after the fact in the comments. I'm sure Will could answer some of those. I'm trying to navigate through your book here to find some of the PSA proof texts, but I'm sure we could just spitball them. Why don't we, how about this? We'll start with two of the strongest passages, as I understand both PSA advocates and non-PSA advocates like yourself and like James Agnew would be Isaiah 53, which we talked a little bit about in the backstage. And it's really interesting, the CSB translation there. And 1 Corinthians
5:21.
5:21.
Yep.
We can talk about those. I can bring them up, or do you have them?
I have them. I was just having them for reference, so it might be easier for you to share your screen on all that, but it doesn't matter either way.
We'll start with, what are we starting with?
Well, let's do 2 Corinthians 5:21 first. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So, the twitchy theologian. You like y'all. You need to study. I should say also, like PSA. Another thing to consider, PSA goes directly against things like Ezekiel 18, which says that like basically no one else will be punished for someone else's sin. It also goes again, and that is quoted multiple times throughout the Tanakh by various people to talk about God's justice. That's how God does justice. We don't punish other people for others. Moses offered to be basically a penal substitute for Israel. God denied it. Paul said he'd rather basically be a penal substitute for his kinsman Israel, and since he wasn't, one would say that was likely denied. A lot of times PSA advocates will say, well, that's because Jesus, he's unique. He volunteered. I'm like, well, these people volunteered, so that doesn't count. Then they're like, well, it's because he was divine. He was able to. And I'm like, what? So God can just, because he's divine, break his own laws, and break his own view of justice? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. So, anyway. That would be that. And Spartan Knights real quick said, Will, when Jesus, so can you pull that up right there? I do feel like I should talk about that real quick. Will, when Jesus defeated death, was that as though death is a personality or force, or was he defeating the adverse effect the fear of death has on our moral choices? So great question. Most people don't actually ask that question. I love that you did. So one is not a personality or force, but it's interesting that Paul does talk about death as if it's personified. Same with Revelation, but that's just to get with kind of the language of it. So they speak as if it's personified, but it's not, and he's described as a tyrant. But Hebrews 2:14 says that it's actually a power, and it's a power of Satan specifically. Satan is the power of death, and yes, that fear of death controlling our moral choices, which can lead us to corruption and a lot of other things. So hope that answers your question, but it's really, that's why sin, death, and Satan, I usually try to keep that unholy trinity together because they're all interconnected with each other. And you'll see that that language is kind of swapped out and used to equivocate, which brings us nicely into 2 Corinthians 5:21. So anyway, sorry, Drew. I saw that and I'm like, that question.
No, that's
I
perfect.
like
I had the question starred, and I was right there with you. So
I need to trust
Mind
you, Drew. I
Warden
need to
also
trust
says
you.
here. I need to talk a little bit quieter, by the way, because people are telling me that I'm being too loud. I'm kind of a loud guy, so I
I'm
get it from my
allowed
dad.
to, but I keep hearing in all my streams, they keep telling me I'm quiet lately. Then lately they said I was fine, but now they're saying I'm quiet in the street. I don't know who it is. Okay, whatever.
Yeah.
I cranked up my mic, and anyway. So
And I'm turning mine down. Mine's almost all the way down, but I'll try to. I'm gonna keep it low key here for a bit. But Mind Warden says that death is an enemy that is thrown into the lake of fire, and you do talk a little bit about just kind of the fear of death and that, as you said, how that affects our moral choices and things. But let's hop into this passage here.
yeah. So with this, it's important, one, to let's understand context. There's a few things I could say about it, but one, the idea here, the main effect here is reconciliation, which, remember, reconciliation never dealt with appeasement of any sort. Okay, so that's really important that we talk about. So he says, "For it is for God," in verse 13, if we are in our right mind, it is for you. For the love of Christ controls us, because we have concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died. So we see what this would be is what we call representative, not substitutionary. And a good way to understand this would be like a politician. A politician represents his country, is a representative of his country, but in football, if you have to swap out your quarterbacks, that's an actual substitute. But because Christ died for all don't die, essentially. So this is, he's a representative of mankind, because we have Satan, who's the accuser, accusing mankind of sin, and he's now representing mankind, defeating sin, death, and Satan all at once, and then welcoming everyone with him. Anyway, jump to verse 16, actually 15. "And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised." And he goes on into saying, it's not according to the flesh. And then if you go to verse 19, that is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself. So it's not about the world, reconciling them, bringing them together, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are all ambassadors. God made his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. There are two main ways a non-PSA advocate would view this. But first, the PSA advocate, I want to point out, is in a really tough pickle if they want to take this actually literally. To say that Jesus actually became sin is probably the best term for it is heretical. The most extreme one would be blasphemous, because he cannot become sin. God in the flesh cannot become literal sin. He would no longer be divine. He would no longer be holy. He would no longer be perfect or righteous. And the Bible says he can't even lie, let alone become sin itself. Lying is one sin. This is becoming something. So PSA advocates began to shy away from a literal interpretation like what Martin Luther did. And actually, when it was like, no, he identified with our sin. Well, that also becomes a problem, because how do you identify with sin without being corrupted with it? Like, I can't say I identify as a murderer without having some sort of fantasies of murder. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's get with some of the metaphor here. The first option is like Paul might be talking about he made him to be sin who knew no sin, and equivocating again sin, death, and Satan. The wages of sin is death. In other words, economically, the sin pays out debt. That's what it pays. So he made him to be sin, which is death. They equate those two, who knew no sin. So he made him die. He had him die. Why? So that he might resurrect and defeat death and ascend to the right hand of the Father, destroying the devil's power and his accusations. Okay. The other thing that it could be, and you can, I think it's, I'll just pull this up, and I know one translation, I can guarantee that it's this way in. I
can share your screen. If you share it with me, I can put it on the screen if that's helpful. Why not?
Oh, that might be. Here, I'll just I have a few screens up, so let me make sure I'm picking the right one. There we go. So let's go with just the TLV. It's one that takes like a lot of Jewish ideas and makes sure they're in there. Verse 21, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin. Wait, nope, I don't think I hit search. Hold on. I hit enter and it didn't work.
Can you make it a little bit bigger on your end? Like if you hit Control Plus, just blow it up.
Needy.
Come on, we gotta please the eye, here on YouTube.
You're right.
Make it easier on our viewers.
All right, he says, but right here, if you go to the TLV, he made the one who knew no sin to become a sin offering on our behalf, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Remember when I said earlier that hatat, if you use that, like it can be sin offering or sin. There's actually a little bit more things with the grammar, like with the T there or whatever, but the point is that when you use these two in conjunction with each other, usually it's oftentimes pointing to one of them referring to sin and the next a sin offering, that they mean the same, that sort of thing. So it could also be that he was making him to be a purification offering, which actually makes a lot more sense for purification, because what sin offerings were. When you compare it to Hebrews, and literally every other place in the New Testament talks a lot about the purification of Jesus in the holy place. So it could be sin offering, or it could be that he identified with like us in the sense that he was mortal enough to die, and that's what sin equaling death there, not literally becoming sin. So I think that's one of the proof texts a lot of people go with, and that's where the idea maybe of imputation comes in, where people go, well, God just considered him to be sin. So some people take an imputation approach where it's less identity and less actually becoming ontologically, but more of imputed unto him. Like I considered him to be sin, even though he was not sin. Problem is that I still think that doesn't jive well with things like Ezekiel 18, where it says that, the Father cannot be held liable for the sins of the Son. So in other words, we're not going to imputation of other people's sin is not something we do. That's against God's justice. So I think this here is better to just go with the idea of sin equaling death, or a sin offering. I take the sin offering approach. I think that makes actually a lot more sense. I've read, there's a lot of journal articles. You can actually look them up online on a lot of like really fancy academic journal articles that will break down this entire thing in the Greek and how it most likely means sin offering.
Yeah, this reminds me a little bit about what you were talking about earlier with regards to things making us uncomfortable and intuitions and so on. And Will and viewers, I have a confession to make. I remember years back, and I would teach this to people in evangelistic conversations with a sense of awe that I felt like was, this God worshipful awe that I don't think now is necessary or correct, with this, bro, Jesus became sin for us. Like, he loved us so much, he became sin. Like, what does that even mean? That's crazy. Like, the Son of God, he became sin. And then I get to become the righteousness of God. That I'm a sinner. How do I become, and it evokes this sense of bro, mind blown kind of thing. But that isn't, just because you sort of feel that way doesn't necessarily make it true. And I do think that it's going to cause a lot, much less, I don't know, I can't speak English, problems if you consider this to be something like a sin offering than you do of Christ becoming sin. I think that's probably just, and you can, maybe you disagree with this, Will, but I feel like you can still hold a PSA and not have to believe that Jesus became sin, right? Maybe. I don't know,
No,
PSA.
you could, and that's what one of the things I kind of even put on toward my book in my book, which is like, look, you don't have to, like, even if you don't agree with me, we can at least accept the fact that this rendition is not good, which is why I think that the imputation, like a lot of PSA advocates go to imputation, they go to identity, they try to go to other things that get them away from becoming sin. Martin Luther actually taught that Jesus became like a murderer and all this stuff at the cross. And that's how it all worked. And it's
you brought this up. Just searched for this and found this earlier because I thought it was a very startling quote from him. And I have it here. I'll read this. This is quoted in your book. This is from Martin Luther. He says, and I forget what passage this is in reference to, but anyways, and quote, "And this saw all the prophets, that Christ was to be of all men the greatest robber, murderer, adulterer, thief, profaner, blasphemer, etc., than whom none greater was ever in the world. For now he bears not his own person. Now he is not the Son of God, born of a virgin, but is a sinner." And then he goes on to say, you're writing here, but the quote continues, quote, "Who has and bears the sin of Paul, who was a blasphemer, a persecutor, and violent, of Peter, who denied Christ, of David, who was an adulterer, a murderer, who made the Gentiles blaspheme the name of the Lord. In a word, who has and bears in his own body all the sins of all men, not in that he committed them, but that he took upon his own body the things committed by us, to make satisfaction for them with his own blood." Obviously, that's the end of the quote. Obviously, the most startling thing here to me is to say that he is not. Like, I know I'm kind of like on the fence on this or whatever, and maybe many of you are, but I hope that most PSA advocates wouldn't say that there was a stage at which Jesus was not the Son of God. I mean, holy cow.
I know, that's like when I went down this rabbit hole before I became the guy of the Atonement guy, and I found that some of these teachings, I was like aghast, and I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, and that's when you really see the rhetoric turning around, is during the Reformation era and stuff, where that gets really starts becoming emphasized, which no wonder, if you're a Protestant or evangelical, you're an offspring from the Protestant Reformation. No wonder why we equate this with the gospel, because this is the way our founding Protestant fathers, articulated this. So it's one of those things I'm also more sympathetic toward. Probably also why my book is a bit more level-headed, is because I preached PSA for years. I distinctly even taught the whole view of the Trinity torn apart for you and for me because it loves you so much. And I'm like, whoa, Will, way to teach some heresy there, man. Like, wow. So I can say I have some humility there, mainly because I realized how bad I destroyed the situation.
Yeah, I was talking to Adam of Curious Christianity. I think we were talking about this backstage because I don't think this was recorded, and I don't think he cares if I say this. If he does, then I'll just edit this out and post after like a couple hundred people see it. But he was talking about how PSA was one of the most painful things for him to let go of because of, I think basically he said, paradigm shifting it was, and because of how often he had promoted it or taught it or whatever. And I've had this, you talk about this as well in your book, Will, where we often speak in the West of the judge courtroom illustration of how, and we hear people like Ray Comfort. As I was considering clips to address, Ray Comfort was in there regarding the judge coming down, taking your place, and being punished in your stead. This is the idea of penal substitution. And I've shared that with people, and that, rightly or wrongly, I guess wrongly if it's not true, resonates with them, like, wow, punished in my stead. That's really interesting. And it is a small step from that to say that, like, Christ suffered in my place because of my sin is perfectly consistent with other views of the atonement, but as far as I understand them anyways. But anyways, he was saying that that was quite difficult to let go. And I think it is something, as I'm reflecting on, I'm like, man, this is, you have to start reforming kind of the way you talk about things, or the way you think
even
about
the way you
things.
present the gospel, like Christ's work, it's like, ooh, that needs a reframing. And oddly enough, the scriptures doesn't really set like a legal paradigm up as much as we create the legal paradigm. For them, it's more relational, it's more participatory, it's and which makes sense. It's an honor shame culture, right? That's more of what we're dealing with, as opposed to legality. But there is still a legal aspect to it. That's why you have the accuser. You have you could talk about a courtroom like in the divine courts where Satan is the accuser of mankind, and God is exonerating them, and no man can serve two masters, so choose your master. Like there is idea of a transfer of ownership away from tyranny. So tyranny is sin, death, and Satan. So there is, these paradigms do exist, and that is a legal aspect to that as well. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's all legal, and that's the only way we should ever explain it. Because what's cool about having a classical view is that it motivates, one, it makes God a defeater of like all things bad, which is just awesome. It's just very like epic. It's a very dramatic backdrop, but also it creates more of a relational, like, I want to participate in this because of how great his work has been done for me. And so it creates, instead of like, because the other thing is like God being so wrathful, he has to pour his wrath out to satisfy justice. So he has to transfer sins to somebody else and punish him and pour his wrath out. Doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense either, because we're told to forgive as God forgave us. And so does that mean I also need to transfer someone's sin to them and punish him? And like, it's just, well, no, we actually see parables directly against that in Matthew 18 and other places, which is the unforgiving servant. He demanded payment after his master freely forgave him, and beat up the guy expecting money, and the master reprimanded him for it. So we have to be careful on how we're viewing that. And that way, actually, the way I would argue, the way a lot of evangelical churches articulate PSA directly contradicts like Jesus' own parables. So anyway.
Yeah, that was a good point that you made as well, and something that we talked about, Brant Hansen and I, in his book Unoffendable, or How to Be Unoffendable, and the idea of forgiveness and things. And I have understood forgiveness previously, and I think that this can still be accurate, that when you are offended by somebody, when somebody wrongs you, you then release them of that debt that they hold, and there is a price to pay for the offense. You're releasing them of that, and you're kind of paying it yourself, is how I would have articulated it, so that the other person doesn't have to pay it. So you're kind of like, okay, I'm just going to take this on the chin. I'm going to suffer the loss here, take the L, suffer the consequence, and release and forgive you. But that's not really the same as my wrath has to go somewhere, and I'm going to pour it out. I mean, if you're using pour it out, or I'm going to direct it at myself or whatever. It's, and like you said, that parable has said that, he just forgives him. There's no mention of sacrifice. And I think, okay, viewers, I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir with Will here, and PSA folks, if you're tuning in for this long with us, congratulations. I'm really glad. I hope that you are. There are just some questions, and you bring this up in your book. Adam and Eve, they sin, very first sin, right? There is a sacrifice that's made, because animals have to die to provide skins, and they're covered, which is another word for this atonement thing. I think that's Kippur.
Yep.
Was the word for is that correct? And so there is, at least at face value, death and blood and so on. But you don't get the sense that there is wrath in that situation. I mean, you could infer that later, and we could talk about progressive revelation and so on. One of me that I'm kind of mulling over right now, and that seems powerful in my mind, is when Moses intercedes for the people of Israel, and he's representing them to God. And you said this in your book, Will. He says, kill me, Lord. If you're, take me instead, basically. And God doesn't do that. He doesn't ask Moses to provide a penal substitutionary sacrifice. And he just releases them and forgives them. And that's where we get this whole, I have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I have compassion on whom I will have compassion. And it just seems like if penal substitution is critical to forgiveness, what happened? And penal substitution, folks, maybe I'm showing my hand and my cards here, and I'm just like rejecting it as I speak, but I guess I'm just wrestling with this. Like, if penal substitution is something that's really important, if it's the gospel, like someone has said, if it's essential, as these things are happening, I mean, there's a passage that talks about, as I've been reading and studying on this, this broken heart, you will not despise. It's like, but there has to be a death, right? There has to be punishment. Well, that's not what that says. And then there are other passages where it talks about, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm just ranting a little bit here, trying to please talk me off the ledge, people. Like, I'm getting ready to jump.
You're talking to the wrong person. I'm just going to go jump. Yeah, just head first, man. It's fine. And the idea is, I don't think even it was considered a penalty. When you as far as maybe a disadvantage or loss, perhaps, but never a punishment, because I don't even think the Bible describes death as punishment. It says that it's the wages of sin. It's like what sin pays out. It's not a punishment. It's like a result of. It's a corruption of God's original creation. It's God didn't say, all right, now I'm punishing you with death. He says, if you do this, you will die. But very much like, if you touch the hot stove, buddy, your hand will burn. I'm not punishing you with that. It's just going to happen. Okay. That doesn't mean that the death penalty is never issued as a punishment. But that's not because all death equals that's like an equivocation fallacy again. Just because death can be punitive doesn't mean all death is punitive, because that would mean babies who die are being punished. And if you're just walking across the street, you get hit by a semi truck and you die because it's a freight liner, that's a punishment. That death isn't punishment as a whole. It's just a corruption. It shows a corruption of our creation, essentially, or that things are outside of the norm of what God created it to be, which was life, because God always compares himself to life. So it makes a lot of sense that even in Romans 5, God is not comparing, it's not an original sin, imputed guilt thing here. Romans 5 says it's comparing the way of Adam, which is death. You're going to die. You're mortal. You're in Adam. But if you go to Christ, he justified and brought life to all, because he's the God of life. So there's this life and death dichotomy that's continually all throughout Scripture. And if you pay attention, you'll start seeing that narrative sewn throughout all of it. I don't have time to break it all down, but it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned this again because this is part of our gospel presentation. Like, if you've ever done a gospel presentation of the Romans Road, where you do, Romans 3:10, there is none righteous, no, not one. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And then you get to this Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death. I have often in evangelistic conversations and just in my own devotional life, my theological mind or whatever, said the wage that I pay for my own sin is death, and Christ can pay it instead of me if I put my trust in him, and you make the subtle nuance that the wage of sin is the wage that sin pays you. Mm-hmm. Like, you sin, and the consequence of that is your death. And I think that that's an important thought, idea, or whatever, as we're discussing this.
Well, yeah, it makes sense because Paul uses a lot of economic language like that, like wages. Okay, what is a wage? Oh, something that's being paid. Who's it being paid? You. The wages of sin is death. Like, oh, well, it makes sense too because we can see that in our own lives. We can see people who sin egregiously and end up dying because of their horrible sin. So, makes sense. Hence, it's a tyrant.
Yeah, and do you think, like, how would you describe the difference between the wage that sin pays is death, and I pay for sin with death? Do you see a difference between those two, or are those two kind of the same in your mind?
Oh yeah. No, I see the difference. Yeah, I pay for sin with death, so I still think it's I think they can be kind of the same depending on what you mean by that. Like, I think it can kind of like, it might be a little bit semantical, but semantics are good. You know, it's the meaning of words. It's important. I just say like with sin pays out, like I prefer using that language, like sin pays you death. Like, and that's usually because that's part of my gospel presentation is we've all sinned and sin pays you nothing but death. It was nothing but it's not just physical death, but death in your relationships, death in your life, death in everything. We see death everywhere. Christ lived a perfect life to destroy the power of sin over the flesh, because that's why he's 100% man, which makes him, well, again, defeats having sin transferred to him defeats the purpose of redeeming the flesh. So he died. Why would he have to become mortal in the first place? Well, to restore human nature. That's why if you read on the incarnation, read the early church on what they believe the incarnation is truly what saved us. Once divinity fused with humanity, it restored human nature back to its original purpose before the corruption of sin. And he died and descended into Hades, as it says. And then when he rose again, it says he defeated it, which is so awesome because we see it's a continual poetry. They call this recapitulation, but we see this beautiful poetry all throughout Scripture of God using his own enemies' weapons against them. So Satan, the serpent, brings in death and through a woman, right? He deceives the woman, and then God brings about the serpent crusher, Jesus Christ, through the seed of a woman. And then with the Egyptians, they slaughtered all the firstborn. What does God do at the end? He slaughters the firstborn. He uses his enemies continually, their weapons against them in a poetic sense. So it makes sense that if Satan's power is sin and death is his power, then God's using death, his own greed. Satan wanted to kill him, but no corruption is found in his mouth, so Satan overstepped his bounds. He only had power of death over sinners, defeated death, and now Satan's rendered powerless, and that's why we're all promised a resurrection in the end, and we get to participate, there's that language again, in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. You've highlighted kind of what began my journey into this, which was as we approached Christmas and I was thinking about these things, I was reading, aka listening via audio, to a book called Reclaiming the Atonement by an Eastern Orthodox guy named Patrick Reardon. And he basically had this idea of, and I talked with Warren a little bit about this, should it be called the atonement or should it just be called the work of Christ? Because the work of Christ begins in the incarnation, and that's something that's amazing and that we all focus in on and celebrate at Christmas time. So I'm reading this, and it is, regardless of the atonement theory that you hold to, it's especially for PSA folks, I don't know where I am in the spectrum right now. I'm confused. We have to open the breadth of the atonement theories and what's actually happening in Christ's work and what is he doing, because it's a lot more, dare I say, use a pious word, like majestic than we want to give it credit for. It's not just him dying, the wrath being poured out on him, and then him being raised and done. But there's so many different facets to that I think really prompt us to worship God and worship Christ for what he's done.
Absolutely. And so I guess we should probably go into some more proof texts. I feel like we got to say I love this topic. It's what I've studied very deeply. I'm probably going to do a lot of my master's and doctoral work, honestly, on this topic, just because I'm like, oh, I already did a lot of the reading, so may as well go deeper. I've realized it's best to just specialize in something because
Totally.
I realize whenever you try to be the broad Bible answers man, it can end poorly by misinformation. So
we're not naming any names here, but
I'm not naming names, but you go to my channel and find out. So yeah, Isaiah 53. Well, okay, before I do that, I should probably mention real quick, people are going to be like, oh, but what about Psalm 22? You know, my God, why have you forsaken me? Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. You know, that's, see right there, he's forsaken. He's forsaken. Jesus said himself. But here, hold on, I'll get my Isaiah 53, but I'll quickly explain Psalm 22. We don't have to break the whole thing down. But if you get to Psalm 22, it basically starts off with the psalmist feeling forsaken by God, but in the end, God redeems him and saves him, actually. So it's this idea of he feels forsaken because he's surrounded by enemies, but God had never abandoned him. And so therefore he's the unforsaken savior. And so it's what we call a remez. I mean, Jesus, we do it all the time. I'm like, you know, if I'm preaching, hey, you preached before, Drew, like, and you're preaching and you go, for God so loved the world. And then you just move on to your next point. You don't say, for God gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him, we don't say that. We just say part of it and everyone goes, right, the rest of the passage. That's all Jesus is doing. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. I was not forsaken by God. He's saying that this is messianic and being fulfilled as we speak. I am surrounded by enemies. It is as if I am being forsaken by God. But in the end of Psalm 22, he's not forsaken by God. He's actually only forsaken. He feels that way because of all the persecution from the enemies. He's just saying it's fulfilled.
Yeah, Peter says here, by the way, Peter, sorry for accidentally banning you earlier. I don't know if I apologized yet for that, but I apologize again. He says, God seems absent, but by the end, he's there. Yeah, it's in Psalm 22, it does seem strange to me for Jesus to quote a psalm in order to teach or show that God, his Father, has forsaken him. A psalm that says that God has not forsaken.
Right. You think you'd be going like Psalm 88 or something that's like super just depressed the entire time.
Right.
But that's not what we see. So it's fascinating. And a lot of people point this out, and a lot of PSA advocates have actually pointed this out. That kind of watered down the penalty aspect of PSA, and like, no, he wasn't actually forsaken by God, but like this whatever was imputed to him, they'll take like a really more watered down approach than what crazy blasphemous drivel we heard from RC Sproul earlier. And that's where I'm not being as nuanced, by the way. Sorry. So people are going to expect this tone. Like some people might buy the book and be like, all right, I get the flamethrower. And then they're like, oh, now he just seems all reasonable and stuff. Like,
I was reading your book and I was like, who is this guy? Like,
who's that guy?
This isn't the guy that I know. He's being so cordial and so charitable.
That's the other half of Will.
Yeah.
I regularly tell people, by the way, I do struggle in real life. Like, there's an actual struggle. My wife will tell you I struggle with either being too nice or too harsh. I always have a hard time. Like, I'm like, where's that middle road? It's like I can turn off the mean side, but then I can turn it too far off sometimes. It's a problem. But anyway, so Isaiah 53 though would probably be the best place for us to make sure we address. There are other things like people point out, like in Romans, that it's like, oh, well, it says right here that we are saved from the wrath of God. And I'm like, well, no, I do not deny the wrath of God, but it says that that's like at the end, it's poured out on the day of the Lord, like when the judgment comes, and not at the cross. It says we're being saved from it, not that it was poured out on Jesus. So that's like, take a closer look at what it's saying and you'll realize, oh yeah, actually that's a good point. Also, this idea that God, I don't know, if you're watching the provisionist perspective, I'm assuming the majority of your audience is non-Calvinist. So what a lot of people probably say that, right? So if just so people are aware, limited atonement was actually justified through penal substitution. Penal substitution was a mechanism that they kind of created because they realized that they had to somehow find a way to justify how limited atonement took place. Because if God satisfied his wrath at the cross, that's universalism. His wrath is satisfied. No one gets wrath. But we see that there's wrath. So they basically what they did is that he transferred the sins of the elect unto Jesus, and he poured out his wrath there. So that way his wrath is still ready and rare for the unelect. So that's kind of the simplified version of the history. So people who are like hardcore, you know, like, nope, I'm provisionist and I'm penal substitution, like all the way. Consider the history, just like as you did where you peeled back the layers on Calvinism. Maybe some of you guys walked out of Calvinism. Consider doing the same thing with PSA and actually really carefully looking at it historically and exegetically. Anyway, just want to make sure I got that out of the way, because I've run into that a lot, where it's really interesting that people don't realize how Calvinist of a doctrine it is, or at least how it was used to justify it. I don't want to do a full equivocation there, because I know that there's nuances that were later developed, but that's the origin, which is uncomfortable for people. So, all right, Isaiah 53, you can pull it up. Sorry, Drew.
That's all right. We always enjoy a good sidebar.
Well, yeah, I'm unfortunately full of them. I'm unmedicated. All right, so Isaiah 53 is probably the strongest proof text for PSA, and I could actually say that I definitely think it's the strongest one. It's actually the one I had to unpack the most. Like the rest, I was like, okay, this is probably pretty, like I was able to see through it, but this one I had to spend some time on. But I'm going to save you guys a lot of energy first and foremost right now. I'm not going to look at the text I'm going to tell you to look at. I'm just going to tell you to go look it up on your own. It's free online. You look up the Septuagint, you can find the Breton's translation of it. Look up Isaiah 53 in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. If you read it, you will find a lot of the verbiage here that we're going to look at is actually non-existent in the old text that the New Testament authors would be writing. Also, it's important to mention that when it talks about bearing one another, like bearing with one another, we think transference, like, all right, he bore our sin. Well, we think transferring our sin ontologically or something like that, or imputation. But if we read, I think it's Matthew 8:17, I want to say it is, but if you read Matthew, he describes bearing our sins and diseases as simply him healing them. So in other words, he came alongside us and lifted us up. That's what it meant to bear. So for him to bear our sins, well, when he became incarnate, he came alongside and bore our sins by becoming a human and coming alongside us and walking through this dirty world together. That in mind, let's go ahead and go to Isaiah 53. Okay. So right here it says, who has believed, who has heard from us, and to him who is the arm of the Lord been revealed. Now, this is one of 4 servant songs in Isaiah. So one is hermeneutics, right? What are we doing here? It's poetry. It's a song. And there's a narrative going on in the song. And we're not going to go there now, but Isaiah 52 basically ends with a bunch of foreign kings looking on the suffering servant and then asking what is going on here. And now we get to Isaiah 53, these foreign kings looking at the suffering servant. Now, when we're looking at Isaiah 53 here, it's important to know that Jews today look at this as suffering servant as likely Israel, that that they are oppressed by all its foreign nations, and that's pretty much been what it was even before that. Like people took Isaiah 53 as probably messianic, but also referring to Israel. But if we make it about penal substitution, then it makes no sense because it means God's punishing Israel in the place of everyone else. So that doesn't make a lot of sense with the historically affirmed view of this. So when we're looking, what is happening here is foreign kings looking at the suffering servant. Okay, we could talk about it being the Messiah. They won't even be able to shut their mouths when they realize it, is what it says that in Isaiah 52. But who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? So these are the kings asking this. Who's the arm of the Lord being revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. So he grew from the beginning. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. So this servant is not particularly attractive, apparently. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. So what's the grief associated with? What's the sorrows associated with? Not the cross, not all that, but by being rejected by men. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Okay. So surely he has he has borne our griefs. Remember, that's coming alongside. He has borne our griefs. He's come alongside us and carried our sorrows. He was helping us. yet we esteemed him stricken by God and afflicted. Other translations say, yet we considered him stricken by God and afflicted. So this guy who is ugly, he's not very attractive. He's no one likes him. No one's really paying attention to him. They don't esteem him. Yet he came alongside to help them anyway. But we considered him to be stricken by God. So ironically, it's the kings, it's the foreign peoples, the oppressors of this person who considered him to be being punished by God. So that means that there's probably not something right here that these people are believing. They believe, it says, we considered him to be, we esteemed him to be punished by God. I actually said that, it's funny because Isaiah 53 is the strongest proof text for penal substitution, yet it seems like in the context is actually directly challenging a lot of the presuppositions in penal substitution. And it says, but he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Again, you can do something for somebody without doing it in their place. He was pierced for them. For what purpose? Well, seemingly at the beginning of this, for restoration and healing, to bear them, to come alongside them. It says he was crushed for our iniquities. Crushed is interesting in the Hebrew because it's the Hebrew word dakah, and dakah means one of two things. Kill, so it's God's will to kill him for iniquities. In other words, for him to die. Well, everyone believes that, no matter what atonement theory you hold to. They all believe that God, in some way, shape, or form, was wanting Jesus to die. Was it to defeat his enemies, or was it to satisfy himself? Is the question that I would raise. But the word dakah also is an idiom, because remember, this is a song, so it's using hyperbole as well, an idiom, and poetic language. That word also means to humble. It means he was humbled for our iniquities. And some people are like, well, why did Jesus need to be humbled? Read Philippians chapter 2. He did not believe equality with God was something to be grasped because he emptied himself. He humbled himself to become man. So then verse 6, all we like have sheep. Oh yeah, right there. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are what? Healed. So again, the emphasis is healing. But what about the chastisement? Well, this word in the Hebrew, a lot of us see right there, the chastisement that brought us peace. It doesn't say whose chastisement. It just says the chastisement. Now, you can take this one of two ways. On a non-penal view would be chastisement was from people. People chastise him. And it brought us peace in the end. The other thing is that it is also the word chastisement is also the same word for just like corrective discipline. So he was, and if you go into Hebrews, that he says he suffered these things unto obedience, and that through them he learned obedience. That through suffering he learned obedience, and Jesus learning obedience is what brought us peace. Or it could just be the chastisement was generally the chastisement of the people. But either way, it doesn't get you to PSA. Is the point. I take this as being the crowd's chastisement because it seems like it's the crowd interacting with this. But I can also see people saying obedience unto. So like obedience through suffering.
At the risk of mansplaining to our viewers, maybe
Yes.
all of you just caught this and you understood this. I'm just going to show it here again, where it says the chastisement that brought us peace. What you're saying is you essentially have two choices here. You can either choose to see this as God's chastisement upon Christ, or you can see it as the chastisement of someone else. Do you think that's an accurate summary of the choices that we have here?
I'd say so. Yeah, I'd say that's a good way to water me down in a more accessible way there. Well, I appreciate you actually doing that because I was like trying to find a way to say it simply, and then you said it way simpler than me. I was like,
no, I think
that.
And I think that it's helpful as I've been thinking about this. We're so trained of seeing things a particular way. We talked about this a little bit backstage. And so it's helpful for us to, if we're going to be good Bereans, or we're going to come to the text and really ask the Lord, like, what does this mean? We need to consider all of the different options that are available to us if we're going to try to be really honest with the text. So,
right, absolutely.
I'll let you go. Continue.
Yeah, no worries. And then he goes on. So after we talked about how, but by his stripes we are healed. So whatever this chastisement was, but it wasn't from God. It was something that Jesus Christ either endured or that people put on him, whatever. All we like sheep have gone astray. So this is the people, the onlookers, like almost weeping or lamenting. We've all gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So in other words, these are the people going, we've done this, and they're still, remember what they do? They're considering this stricken by God. That's why I took the chastisement, I think it's the people's chastisement, because they still said they consider this all being done by God. That's the whole point of what they're trying to say. They consider it being done by God, but really he's trying to heal them. He is healing them. Because he goes on, so that's where, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This is also what's fascinating, is that iniquity doesn't necessarily have to mean like a sin transference. What happened at the cross? How was iniquity laid on Jesus? Well, actually, pretty obviously, he was whipped with every stripe on his back that we are healed. That says we are healed. By every stripe, iniquity was being inflicted upon his body. He was literally experiencing the iniquity of the people. So on him, the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. In other words, he let them have their way with him. Like, he was beaten, he was afflicted, all those things. And go ahead.
So when you say, let's see if I get this right. When you say the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all, and you're talking about the stripes, for instance, you would say that because the stripes were sinfully executed, like they're being put upon an innocent man that's being condemned as guilty, and he's willingly receiving that, he's submitting to that. It's in that metaphorical sense that our iniquities are being laid on him. Is that
correct?
Kind of how you're saying that?
A good way I describe this, and it's a little personal, but it's a good way to describe it. So I was raised in a very abusive home. So I've been struck by a parent's fist before, right? And so I had a bruised face and a bruised neck from when like my parent grabbed me by the throat. Well, when that happened, and I went to church with this big bruised mark, I had the iniquity on me. The iniquity was laid on me, and you can see it.
Right.
So it's a very good visual on understanding how that works. And so again, this idea of sin transference just didn't exist in the Hebrew Bible. So if your hermeneutic is going to sin transference, you're probably misunderstanding it. The only place you could get close to it is the symbology of the one goat sent away that gets to live, right? So that, again, the typology is wrong.
Right.
And this actually reinforces my point, because what are they trying to say? This guy came alongside us to help us, but we despised him, and we considered him basically anathema, and we killed him. God, the wrath of God was upon him because he was a heretic or a blasphemer or whatever, that people didn't like him, right? That's literally what got Jesus crucified, right? Like blasphemy, and he tore his robes. So the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. So again, it is reiterating that fact of we are oppressing him, which is why the iniquity of us all is probably in that context. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. So in other words, he went willingly, they had their way with him. By oppression and also meekness, there's a symbol of meekness there. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off the land of the living, cut off from the land of the living, what is that? Death, right? Stricken for the transgressions of my people. And so right there, he's even asked the question, who, considering that he was cut off, so he who was killed, he died, was stricken for the transgressions of my people. Like who would do this, like essentially? And they made his grave with the wicked, with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. That word crush is daka again, to humble him or for him to die. He has put him to grief. Well, grief isn't to be held guilty or liable. Jesus experienced a lot of grief, right? Like on the cross. So when his soul makes an offering for guilt, what is a guilt offering? It's reconciliation. That's what it's about. It is not about the person actually being guilty of anything. Again, do some Levitical studies. I highly recommend Milgram or Lamb of the Free, something like that. And he'll break that down. He shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Okay, so he will see his offspring. So those who are saved, right? Those who participate and become sons of God. He shall prolong his days. You know, if you're dealing with eternity, the will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Then finally here, out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. And then people go, aha, right there, satisfied. First off, you won't find that. Read verse 11 in Septuagint. Anyway, but out of the anguish of his soul, so pain of his soul, he will see and be satisfied of what? It doesn't say of his wrath or of his judgment or of his justice. But it does go on to say, by his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. So again, coming alongside them, bearing them and restoring them, he has accounted them. So what is being satisfied here? Well, presumably having the knowledge that the righteous one will save people, that he will heal them. So really, it's more like after you do, I don't know if you've done ever like a remodel project or something like that, Drew, but this year I remodeled our main living area because our house was miserably cared for originally. So I remodeled a lot. And I tell you what, it was grueling to go through it. But then afterwards, I looked back and looked at it and I was satisfied. It was so satisfied because I did a good thing. So that seems to be what is being satisfied here, is a good thing.
So what you're saying, Will, is that you're Jesus.
Am I on channel 4? I don't.
You can hear the comments coming.
I didn't know you were Kathy Newman. Ha! We kid. Then finally, verse 12. Therefore, I will divide him a portion with the many. He shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he has poured out his soul to death. Okay, not to God, not for punishment or anything, and was outnumbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. So he's numbered among them. Why? Because he was killed like a criminal would be, even though he was innocent, like as I talked about earlier. And what's even more fascinating is I break this down more. You can actually read the script in this way in my book. I'll just mention that there are two voices actually going on in the Hebrew, where it's basically the prophet speaks and then the people are responding, like kind of like a liturgy, so to speak. And so it's going back and forth. And when you see it that way, it becomes very clear on what is really happening here, which is a conversation between what is right and what is wrong. And the people are going, this is what was right. And the people are going, this is what was wrong. And the prophet's going, but this is what was right. And so, again, you don't have this idea of wrath, appeasement, punishment in our place. None of that. So anyway.
No, I think that's really helpful. Thanks for walking through that. We've got another. Drew, your volume is louder than Will. I think I need to talk quieter. If I turn it all the way, is that muted? Can you even hear me now?
I can hear you still.
Okay. That's all the way down.
I wonder if it's a StreamYard thing. It might be something in our sound settings here.
Maybe it is.
I have automatically adjust mic volume clicked on my end under audio settings, so I don't know if that would help you.
Okay, we'll try this. How does this sound? We're doing a little bit of production stuff here at the end. Kiss the Sun. Does this sound better?
It sounds the same to me. Here, if I got rid of automatically adjust mic volume, am I too loud now, folks? Did anything change?
Say something else.
Hello. PSA is false. Changed my mind.
It sounds the same to me, but anyways,
I don't know what's going on with the audience there. I don't know.
It's all of you. It's all your problem. It's not us. No, I appreciate you walking us through the Isaiah 53 passage. I'm glad you pushed us to get there, because I just would have ADD'd all over the place and not actually gotten to the passage. I think we've talked about two passages today. So we appreciate it continuing to be addressed. If the problem isn't fixed, heckle us about it, because it's helpful to us when we're streaming live. If something happens and we try to fix it,
and it helps us to know how to correct it even in the future. If we can't figure it out now, we can look it up and figure out what's going on. So we appreciate knowing that we did not indeed fix it when I cranked up my mic earlier. So
yeah, and as I was turning mine down. But yes, I appreciate you walking us through that and offering your perspective. I'm really looking forward to getting some engagement, especially from Brother David Allen on this. And viewers, check out the book. Go over to the Church Split and his channel. You've been doing a series responding to Mike Winger. It's Crushing the Great Serpent. Did God Punish Jesus? And I think you can get it on Kindle for, I think it's $15 or so.
Yeah.
You sent me a PDF copy so that I could have it. I'm still working on increasing the channel's budget to be able to afford to actually purchase books that I can review.
And keep watching your videos so that budget can increase.
Yeah. And speaking of, if you would like to support this channel, if you've lasted this long, I really appreciate it. Hopefully it means that you're enjoying this. If you would consider joining Patreon, that would really help out. We have a little bit of a budget deficit in terms of how much it costs to do this stuff with different subscriptions and things and commissioning thumbnails and all that good fun stuff. So, or you can also join the YouTube link. I just added a new tier so you can join for just $3 a month on YouTube as well. So
I will say this about that, like, so to throw this to promote you a little bit here, is that idea, like, so in the YouTube space, pretty much you're encouraged to make the most clickbaity content on the planet. And and some of us, like, I've done like certain ones that I call my net casters, and I will continue to do those where they're like a very broad audience, and I feel like they're good intention. They're actually not clickbait because I actually like, or they might be, but I actually deliver on the clickbait itself.
Sure.
So, but it's one of those things where
good bait.
Yes, it's good bait. But the thing is, it's like, I really would encourage people now. We're in the space where support your creators, support the people that are doing that, especially the smaller ones, because we don't tend to always get the limelight. Like, especially like, you know, this, like, there's Mike Winger, there's like some really big Christian names, Alan Parr, and the algorithm will always favor them. So it makes it hard for smaller channels to even let people know they're there. And usually the smaller channels, by the way, are the ones who actually like do really hard work. They do a lot of studying, and they don't do as much like shooting off to the wind like some of these other like discernment ministries do, even though they have bigger followings. So my point of that is definitely join Drew's channel or his Patreon, because he deserves it. He does a lot of hard work on this, and I love it. So support Drew.
No, I appreciate that. And while we're promoting one another, be sure to buy Will's book. I've not finished it yet, but I'm going to get there. I've been really enjoying it. Like I said, it's really accessible. It's easy to read. You do get like into the geekiness and stuff, but it doesn't get overly technical to where it's not, you know, it's kind of going over your head or whatever.
I'm not bringing down what a peel verb is in the Hebrew. I just footnote it and call it a day.
Yeah. And I've been going through the footnotes, you know, if you want to dig in a little bit deeper, and you obviously refer to all the people that you've researched and stuff here. So if you want to go even deeper, you know, start with his book, kind of get the idea, and then dig even deeper. Maybe he's full of it. Maybe he's wrong. You know, I don't, you know, stick around for the Atonement series. Start next week, and continuing on next week with James Agnew, followed by Brother David Allen. Hopefully going to have somebody on after that. And the debate on atonement, on penal substitutionary atonement. Hopefully it's going to happen. We're going to have to, I'm going to message David Pullman after we end this, but
I'm going to smoke him. Like you say, he's my friend. That's what people think. I'm like, wow, he's really arrogant. Like, no. David Pullman and I, we talk trash to each other about this topic. It's a thing. We love each other, but I'm probably going to his wedding even. Like, it's a thing. It's fine.
It's a friendly thing.
Yes.
How blessed it is when you can insult your brother in good fun.
Yes. It's like I have to do that. If I can't do that, then it's not worth it.
Thank you, Mine Warden. He says, God bless you all again, even Will. Mine Warden has joined us in a chat where we are going through a book series called Cradle. And it's a fantastic book series. It's clean, it's fun, it's a little bit violent at stages, but not overly so. It seems like something you could read with youngish kids, but shameless plug for a fantasy, if you're into fantasy, that sort of thing. I'm going to shut up now. Guys, you are blessed. Go and be a blessing to someone this week. And Will, thanks for being on. Hopefully we'll have you on again here soon.
All right, guys. Thank you.